House.
From 6, it's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Monday to Thursdays on GB News.
Britain's news channel.
Westminster is going around in ever-decreasing circles, followed by the media. Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it? Join me at 7 p.m, Mondays to Thursdays on Farage, here on GB News. We will have open, rational debate. We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this. Join us here on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain is watching.
When the news happens, it happens here.
And really important breaking news.
Breaking news this morning.
On TV, radio and online, the news starts here on Britain's Newsroom.
All the biggest stories and the answers that you need from across the UK and beyond.
Join Britain's Newsroom from 9:30 on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Patrick Christie's, Monday to Friday, 3 till 6. We tackle the day's news agenda like you've never seen before. It's high tempo, high octane, the most controversial topics and the best guests. You will not be able to take your eyes and ears off it. I'm not afraid to ask the questions that you really want answered. 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
People in Britain, they love free speech, but they also love fair play.
I don't care if I'm speaking somebody from a trade union, from the Labour Party, somebody from the SNP. And I think the viewers like to see that actually we can challenge one another, but in a positive way.
We think we ask the questions that people want to ask, and often we ask the questions that we wanted to ask in Parliament but never got the chance to ask.
So join us every Saturday, 10 a.m. till noon on GB News,
Britain's news channel.
Hi, I'm Dan Wootton. You can watch me live on GB News Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. And did you know that you can also watch and listen live on our website, gbnews.com? You'll always be up to date on the latest breaking news, as well as enjoying the best stories, opinions and shows. You can even join the debate under our live player as you're watching. So head straight to gbnews.com on TV, radio and online. GB News, Britain's news channel.
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, "No, stop arguing." I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment. I came to GB News because it's the People's Channel, and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different.
Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story.
We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
Is the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News,
the People's Channel,
Britain's news channel.
With GB News this Sunday. Good evening. The top story this hour. Daniel Khalif has been charged with escaping custody after 4 days on the run from the authorities. The 21-year-old escaped terror suspect had strapped himself underneath a food delivery lorry to escape from Wandsworth Prison on Wednesday. He was tackled from his bicycle on a canal towpath in West London by a police officer yesterday, and he's due to appear at Westminster Magistrates Court tomorrow. Well, the Justice Secretary says around 40 inmates have now had to be moved out of Wandsworth Prison amid an investigation into Daniel Khalif's escape. Alex Chalk saying the prison is overcrowded, but he said the government is doing all it can to provide resources. And in other news today, the TUC is reporting the government to the United Nations over a new UK law requiring staff to work during strikes. The TUC's General Secretary saying the legislation falls far short of international legal standards. The government, for its part, though, says the law protects the lives of the public, such as in the case of doctors' strikes, and recently announced a consultation on how the law is to be enacted. To North Africa now, where rescue workers and residents fear for the stability of local buildings as earthquake aftershocks hit the country of Morocco. More than 2,100 people have lost their lives since the 6.8 magnitude quake rocked areas of the Atlas Mountains on Friday. The Moroccan military making roads safe and clear to allow aid and medical treatment to get through to the thousands of people who are still injured. The country has declared 3 days of national mourning. The Prime Minister says he's confronted the Chinese Premier Li Qiang at the G20 summit in New Delhi over alleged spying in Westminster. The Sunday Times reports a man in his 20s and another in his 30s were arrested back in March under the Official Secrets Act. One of the men was apparently a researcher with links to several Tory MPs. And finally, Sir Mo Farah has completed the final race of his career, sealing his 4th place in the Great North Run today. The 4-time Olympic champion said it had been an amazing journey. Well, as he approached the finish line, he was greeted by vast crowds, some of them trying to high-five him and him holding his hands aloft in his famous M shape as he crossed over the finish line. The sports star announced just early this year that the time had finally come for him to move on from running. You're with GB News across the UK on TV, in your car, on digital radio, and now on your smart speaker by saying play GB News. This is Britain's news channel.
Good morning and welcome to the Camilla Tominey Show. There's a word for this show today and it is big, because we've got a big show lined up. Now I'm delighted to be joined by Alex Chalk, the Justice Secretary and Conservative MP for Cheltenham. Lovely to speak to you this morning, Minister. I know you've had a very busy week and indeed weekend. Let's start with the Daniel Khalif recapture. Now, we had Charlie Taylor, the Inspector of Prisons, recommending that Wandsworth Prison be closed down. I understand you've moved, 40 prisoners from Wandsworth. Surely if you're having to move prisoners because of concerns about the prison, then the prison itself isn't fit for purpose.
Well, can I start, first of all, by echoing something that came from your People's panel, which is to thank the police for having done an exceptional job, and also to iterate these are very, very rare incidents, and much rarer, incidentally, than about 20 years ago. But we take it extremely seriously, which is why I've instituted 2 investigations, first into the circumstances of what happened, specifically the alleged escape, and second, in terms of the categorisation. And I asked for preliminary conclusions to be on my desk by the end of the week, which is today. And what I can tell your GB News viewers is that the protocols that you would expect to be in place, in other words, to ensure that for example, that physical head counts are taken before the call is made to the control office, those were in place, and about searching and so on. And also the security staff were in place. What really remains to be decided, or remains to be established, is were those protocols followed? And that's what we're getting to the bottom of. And there's also, for an added layer of clarity, an independent investigation to ensure those findings are absolutely crystal clear.
But why have you moved these 40 prisoners out of Wandsworth then?
So look, plainly, this is because we take this so seriously. Out of an abundance of caution, we've done a number of things to surge resources into Wandsworth, as you would expect. For example, there is an additional governor support, so somebody who has experience of working as a governor, but also with specific security expertise, additional staff down there to support the prison service, but also, out of an abundance of caution, we've taken 40 out to move elsewhere, just as we get to the bottom of what happened. Now, that is a sensible, interim, precautionary step. And I just also want to make the point about Wandsworth. There have been issues with crowding, which I accept, which goes back for not just 5 years, or 25, 30 years. But the difference is we are doing something about it. So very, very significant investment going into prisons. 2 already built, 1 currently under construction. And these are big, big jails.
But then there'll be people who are listening to that who'll be kind of incredulous, because a lot of this has happened under Tories' watch. Chris Grayling, famously nicknamed Failing Grayling when he was at Justice Secretary, he was the one who was criticised for bringing in these measures which effectively forced more experienced prison officers out of work. They decided to retire, it was all too much. Inexperienced officers came in, and you had a situation in some prisons when the inmates seemed to be in control. So this has happened under Tory governance, hasn't it?
Well, on the political thing, I think it's an unfair attack, and I'll say why. That in the last 13 years, the number of escapes is around about 20. In the 13 years before that, it was about 170. So that's the first point. That these are very, very rare. That's the first thing. But the second thing is, this is really, really important, is that the investment that is going in now and has gone on over recent years, incidentally authorised by this Prime Minister as Chancellor, is the biggest programme of investment since the Victorian era. So it's not just new prisons, important though they are. It's refurbishing blocks in HMP Liverpool, in HMP Birmingham, in Stockton and Rye Hill. It's about rapid deployment stuff. So vast investment going in. And this is the important point, not in response to a Khalif incident, but this has been going on for very many years and is really starting to make a difference.
OK, but unfortunately there is this perception, rightly or wrongly, that actually the Conservatives haven't been tough on crime, or indeed, if I may use the phrase, the causes of crime. I look in the Mail on Sunday at the moment, Mr. Chalk, and they've had to launch a campaign to get the police to do more about shoplifting of items worth less than £200. There's this phrase going around called low-level crime. The police aren't dealing with low-level crime. No crime is low-level to the person who's a victim of it, is it? There's this perception that under Tory governance, the stance on crime has become softer, not tougher. Could you address that, please?
Well, that would be wrong, and I'll explain why, if I may. So first, there are more police officers than at any time in our history. That's the first thing. But second, if I look at offences which did not exist when we came into power, so I'm particularly passionate about trying to address violence against women and girls. Let me say, coercive and controlling behaviour did not exist. Non-fatal strangulation was not a separate offence. Revenge porn didn't exist. Stalking wasn't a crime. So we've created these offences. Also, I mean, something dear to my heart, that's stalking. We doubled the maximum sentence.
I know, but
Death
if you
by
have
dangerous
a
driving
burglary,
used to be 14 years, now life. So all I'm saying is that the resources are going in and the sentencing lengths are there.
If you're the victim of a burglary, as I have been, and effectively the police says, well, just get the insurers to deal with it, we're not going to investigate, it doesn't inspire confidence.
Well, look, can I just say I'm incredibly sorry that you were a victim of burglary. It's a horrible, brutal, violating crime, and I don't know what happened in your specific case, but it is an appalling offence, and I would expect it to be investigated. I've been a victim of burglary as well. So look, I absolutely know that, but all I'm saying is that the resources are there, that police officers are there to conduct those investigations, and the sentencing powers are there as well. And we're recruiting more judges, increasing the amount of legal aid investment, and so on. So we are doing everything we can to ensure that victims get justice.
Well, on that note, the Crown Court backlog of cases in England and Wales was 62,766. What is it now?
So it is around 63,000. I think it's important to just put a couple of things in context. No, that's right, but it's important to understand this. First of all, 90% of all crime is actually prosecuted and tried in the Magistrates' Court. That's the first thing. And there they've snapped back really quite well. As for the Crown Court, which you're referring to, we inherited a caseload of around 48,000. It was then about 40,000 before the pandemic, and then it ticked up. And that's because, frankly, there are few systems, and our jury system is incredibly precious, and it safeguards rights and liberties and ensures that the guilty are convicted and the innocent walk free and so on. But it was very, very badly affected by COVID, which is why we're working our way through. We've put huge resources. That's to say, we've got Nightingale courts, which are still open, 1,000 additional judges, up to £141 million more as legal. So we are working through it. We're putting the downward pressure on that. And the final point I want to make, if I may, is we have quadrupled funding for victim services so that those people who are, perhaps like you or others, who are victims of crime get the support that they deserve.
All right, but we have concluded that the backlog is still as big as it was pre-COVID. One more question on this Chinese pie story, which I'm sure you've seen on the front of the Sunday
but just very quickly, it went down.
But it's gone back up.
Yep, go ahead, please.
On the Sunday Times...
Yeah, that's because we had the industrial action. We had industrial action.
We've had Rishi Sunak today. He says he's taken on this case of this Chinese spy infiltrating the House of Commons with the Chinese Premier Li. What's your reaction to this story? Because this Chinese spy appears to have got close not only to the Security Minister, but also the chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee.
Yeah, well, of course, it's significant, it's important, and the parliamentary authorities and indeed other agencies will no doubt wish to get involved, and that's got to take its course and proceed in stages in the normal way. But the general point that I would make is that the Prime Minister has been very clear that China is an epoch-defining challenge. We stand up for our values, we engage, but we do so with caution and calibration.
Alex Chalk, thank you so much for joining me this morning.
That warm feeling inside. From Boxed Boilers, proud sponsors of weather on GB News.
Good evening, my name's Rachel Ayres and welcome to your latest GB News weather forecast brought to you by the Met Office. So there's been plenty of heavy showers and thunderstorms around throughout today and they will continue during tonight. And this is because low pressure is starting to dominate the UK weather, clearing away that high pressure we saw during last week. So into this evening then, showers and thunderstorms will continue for a while, but generally starting to clear out into the North Sea, though lingering for a little longer across southern Scotland. Clear spells in the east, but some mist, fog and low cloud developing, and that's all during another warm and fairly humid night. There will be some brightness to start Monday, but any mist, fog and low cloud will lift and break before we see this area of cloud and outbreaks of rain spreading southeastwards. Maybe some heavy showers and thunderstorms for England and Wales just ahead of that. But there will be some sunny spells too, and feeling pleasant in the sunshine still, even though we're not getting into the 30s, still the mid to high 20s for the highs on Monday. As we go into Tuesday, that band of cloud and rain continues to make its way southeastwards, becoming a little heavier and slow moving as it comes across England and Wales, but starting to see those winds come from the north across parts of Scotland, Northern England and Northern Ireland. So starting to feel cooler, but generally remaining changeable throughout the week, but most noticeably those temperatures dropping down to average.
That warm feeling inside. From Boxed Boilers, proud sponsors of weather on GB News.
What you get for breakfast is something that, if we do our jobs right, you will wake up to news that you didn't know the night before.
It's a conversation. It's not just me and Eamon.
We want to get to know you, and we want you to get to know us.
From 6, it's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Monday to Thursdays on GB News,
Britain's news channel.
Westminster is going around in ever-decreasing circles, followed by the media. Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it? Join me at 7 p.m, Monday to Thursdays on Farage, here on GB News. We will have open, rational debate. We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this. Join us here on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain is watching.
When the news happens, it happens here.
And really important breaking news.
Breaking news this morning.
On TV, radio and online, the news starts here on Britain's newsroom.
All the biggest stories and the answers that you need from across the UK and beyond.
Join Britain's newsroom from 9:30 on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Patrick Christie's Monday to Friday, 3 till 6. We tackle the day's news agenda like you've never seen before. It's high tempo, high octane, the most controversial topics and the best guests. You will not be able to take your eyes and ears off it. I'm not afraid to ask the questions that you really want answered. 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
People in Britain, they love free speech, but they also love fair play.
I don't care if I'm speaking somebody from a trade union, from the Labour Party, somebody from the SNP. And I think the viewers like to see that actually we can challenge one another, but in a positive way.
We think we ask the questions that people want to ask, and often we ask the questions that we wanted to ask in Parliament but never got the chance to ask.
So join us every Saturday, 10 a.m. till noon on GB News,
Britain's news channel.
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, no, stop arguing. I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment.
I came to GB News because it's the People's Channel, and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different.
Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story.
We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
It's the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Now, John McTernan, Political Secretary to Tony Blair, joins me now. Lovely to speak to you this morning, John. Now, I want to start perhaps with Keir Starmer's reshuffle and perhaps what you made of it. I mean, he's installed a number of Blairites. He's sidelined his leadership rival, Lisa Nandy. Is this him pandering to the right, do you think, John, in a bid to win the next general election?
Well, look, he's given a massive job to his deputy leader, Angela Rayner. She's now in charge of building, planning, local government, regional inequality, and on top of that, she's going to have to deal with devolution and the plans for a Labour government devolving power to councils and more power to Scotland and Wales. So a gigantic responsibility for somebody who is from the soft left. He also kept Ed Miliband in place. So I think the idea it's a shift to the right is to misunderstand it. It's a shift to promote those who are talented and those who performed well. And people who've shone in their posts, whether in the cabinet or in ministerial roles, have been moved up a rung. And you see that with Liz Kendall's promotion. You see it with Peter Carl's promotion to Science Minister. And you see it, the sense of a shadow cabinet ready to go, we are an alternative government, which I think is the answer to all the troubles the government's having is, well, there is an alternative to people who can't seem to sort anything out, and it's this team. And I think Keir's got his team for the next election now.
I was just surprised by Lisa Nandy because I think she's quite an accomplished media performer. She's got clarity of thought and ideology, and she's quite a strong player on that shadow front bench. But equally, isn't the Angela Rayner promotion just a case of keep your friends close and your enemies closer?
Well, no, because the deputy leader is a post elected in its own right. So they're not rivals. They have separate mandates. And what you have to do, Margaret Thatcher understood, she said about Willie Whitelaw, her deputy prime minister, every prime minister needs a Willie. I mean, everybody needs a deputy who's a contrast to them. And that's the thing I think that Keir's understood. Angela needs a front and centre role. Shadowing the cabinet office was not a big enough position for her. He didn't bring her talents to the front. And the way she used to frighten Boris Johnson when she stood in for Keir at PMQs, I think he's going to frighten Michael Gove. He won't quite know what to do with it. I don't think any Tory minister quite knows how to handle Angela Rayner. I think, Lisa Nandy is a great politician from her own point of view, very strong view of the world, very good communicator. And I think she can restore the reputation of the UK in international affairs, doing the different part of the ex-EDO portfolio. That's really critical for an incoming government.
I'm delighted to be joined in the studio now by Lord Agnew, who was the anti-fraud minister in the Cabinet Office from 2020 to 2022. Prior to that, he was schools minister. Now, Lord Agnew will perhaps be best known to many of our viewers for your dramatic resignation from your role as an anti-fraud minister in the House of Lords last January. You said that the government had been too lax in awarding COVID bounce-back loans and were not doing enough to investigate them retrospectively. Let's just remind ourselves of that moment.
Total fraud loss across government is estimated at 29 billion a year. Of course, not all can be stopped, but a combination of arrogance, indolence and ignorance freezes the government machine. Action taken today will give this government a sporting chance of cutting income tax before a likely May 2024 election. If my removal helps that to happen, it would have been worth it. So it leaves me only to thank the noble Lord Tunnicliffe for his courteous but attentive role as my shadow minister of my portfolio, and to thank noble friends, many of whom I know will carry on their scrutiny of this important area. Thank you and goodbye.
It's the closing of the book. Right, I'm off. You were clearly incensed by what you saw as Treasury inaction over COVID loan fraud. What went wrong?
Well, it was panic initially. That they were very worried that the productive economy would be destroyed by the forced closure of millions of business with COVID, which was a perfectly reasonable reaction. But they then just closed their ears to sensible suggestions that could have dramatically reduced the amount of fraud that emanated from the loan schemes that they put in place.
Why do you think they did that? Was it a case of, oh, well, you know, we've got bigger fish to fry, we're just going to have to just close our eyes to what's going on because it's too big to solve?
Well, I honestly don't know, because I literally had shouting matches with them. I mean, I was so frustrated at the time when they put the loan structure in place, and I warned them that they were creating an absolute nightmare for the future, and that the excuse was a few credit checks would unreasonably delay getting the money out to these businesses, which is total rubbish. I mean, it would have delayed it by a few hours, literally. There were something like 15,000 duplicate loans. So businesses were applying on multiple occasions for the loan when they're only entitled to one loan.
Was that just maladministration by the Treasury? Is it just total ineptitude?
Yes, well, that's what I said in my resignation speech.
I mean, it's not obviously something that's been done on purpose, but it's just a lack of checking, a lack of oversight and a lack of auditing.
Correct.
How much do we think taxpayers lost during this period?
Well, it's very difficult to quantify it, because do you call a duplicate loan a fraud? So I don't know how they're calculating those. But how many of those who received more than one loan have paid them back?
Well, so, do we have an answer to that question?
Well, not to my knowledge.
Practically none would be my guess.
I suspect very few. So you've got those, and then you've got those who are actually crooked. So there were 1,500 loans that went out to companies that weren't even trading when COVID hit, because, again, of naivety. So there were a whole range of these issues. And then I did fight a rearguard action to try to recover this by getting additional resource. I only wrote one letter to the then Chancellor as my boss in the Treasury, asking for more resource to go after this.
You wrote a really lengthy letter explaining the problems, what was happening, what was going wrong.
Correct.
And you laid it all out very early on. What was the response?
Not interested, really, other than, well, departments need to find the money from their own resources.
And why do you think he took that approach? Because he was overly concerned with furlough and his own performance during the pandemic, eat out to help out?
Well, I think he was overwhelmed by the crisis, and I mean, I can't blame the government for that, because it was unprecedented in peacetime. But it was frustrating that they weren't prepared to listen to someone with a business background who actually understood how this stuff worked.
Did you ever have any face-to-face discussions with him, or was it all by letter?
Well, and we met periodically. I mean, we met as a ministerial team on probably a fortnightly basis, but I couldn't get the message through.
But what are you saying, that it was fingers in ears, we don't want to hear this?
Pretty much, yeah.
It's depressing, that. I mean, as a long-serving Tory, you must have been quite upset.
Yeah. Well, the problem is it's the amount of money that's lost, which we'll come to this in a moment when we talk about economic growth and how we can create that. We're losing this money, which could be so much better used. And I mean, the National Audit Office put the figure at 30 billion a year in fraud loss in government before COVID. So
I mean, it's just an astonishing amount.
Now, you're not going to get all of that.
Before COVID?
Yes. So the problem has been endemic for a long time. So that's why the thing needs a real focus.
And you know what will incense our viewers and listeners is that if there's some problem, some slight anomaly with your tax return, HMRC will be down your throat before you can say, oh, my goodness, where are my bank files? And yet, at the same time, a blind eye has been turned to basically widespread fraud worth millions and billions.
There was also promise of a fraud bill in this Parliament.
What happened to that?
Well, it's disappeared. So
OK, so look, let's talk about growth. And I know you want to talk about sort of what more we could be doing for productivity particularly. You said at the time, look, I'm resigning because if you did claw back some of this money, we could have income tax cuts. I take it you still think we should have income tax cuts?
Well, we have to be very careful at the moment because we are in a very perilous financial position. So we have a structural deficit each year where we are spending 85 billion more than we are generating in revenue from taxes. So, of course, I would like to see tax cuts, but we cannot. This is why the Truss government failed so quickly. She announced unfunded tax cuts, and the gilt markets, the international markets who lend us the money to keep going, they didn't like it, and that's why...
But did she have a point about trying to fight Treasury orthodoxy, changing the status quo, trying to stimulate more growth than this sort of flatlining figure that we've grown used to, that many describe as managed decline?
And 100% she was on the right track, and getting rid of the then head of the Treasury, Thomas Scholar, was a good move.
Was it? Because people say that was part of the reason the markets were spooked and that Kwasi Kwarteng showed arrogance in doing that.
Well, he was a main blocker to I mean, I had to deal with him when I was a minister.
What Scholar was?
Yes.
What do you mean?
Well, he was simply manage the status quo, manage decline, and bring all this control of the finances to the centre and in a short-term way. And we'll discuss a little bit about that on the school buildings later.
Yeah, but just tell me about the attitude, because obviously you've had this kind of front row seat inside the Treasury, and we've heard so much criticism over the years from people who are more on the right, people who are more of a Brexit persuasion, saying that there's groupthink. What's wrong with the Treasury as a whole? They're left-wing, they're economically completely opposed to kind of Thatcherite economics. What's the deal?
The first thing is the average age is 29.
Right.
So you have very bright people with very, very little lived experience. So they haven't been out in the front line of business, creating wealth. They've never been there. They've been to a smart university and then they go into the Treasury. And the turnover of staff there is colossal. It's 25% or something like that.
Yeah.
So you're losing. So you don't get the traction of people who become expert in the way in their portfolios because they're moving so quickly. On top of that, they try to micromanage the whole of government. So tiny sums of money will end up with them being scrutinised, whereas they lose sight of the big picture.
So they block policies all the time because they're looking for the bottom line. We're fast running out of time because it's been so fascinating speaking to you. Let's just talk about RAC briefly. You were schools minister. Did you know that this concrete was a problem waiting to happen back in the day?
It's been on the agenda for years.
Should the government have done more about it preemptively? Because obviously closing down school classrooms 2 days before the start of term seemed a little bit after the event.
Well, they could have done it at the beginning of the holidays, couldn't they?
Well, couldn't they? But why don't they?
You'll have to ask them that. I've been out of the department for a long time. But I had probably 10 meetings with the Treasury when I was also the Capital Schools Minister, so I had the envelope of Schools Capital when I was there, and I was trying to get them to give me a long-term envelope. So I said, give me a 10-year envelope of money. It doesn't have to be any more, but then I can go out to the building industry and say, here is a 10-year programme so that you can tool up for dealing with these refurbishments.
And?
Well, they wouldn't. They said it has to sit within the spending review. But I said to them, well, are we not going to have any schools at the end of the spending review? I said, what's going to happen after the year or the 3-year spending review? And of course, they don't have an answer to that.
So you seem to be saying that a lot of these roadblocks, when it comes to the government trying to enact its own policies, or indeed ministers like you coming up with ideas to solve problems, are constantly being blocked by the Treasury.
Continually. Which is why one thing I pushed for when Truss was briefly in power was you need to take a responsibility for economic growth from the Treasury and have a small team directly answerable to the Prime Minister who deliver on that. Because that's the most important agenda. I mean, I know we're running out of time, but Camilla, it's just important to give you a couple of numbers. So the share of if you compare us to America over the last 20 years, our percentage of per capita income has fallen steadily. Yeah. So we now, as a country, rank just above Alabama. So, and we have fallen progressively over the last 20 or 30 years. And if we could increase per capita GDP by 3%, within 15 years, that would be another £650 billion a year in revenue. Forget inflation, but just to take the simple numbers. So you'd get your tax cut. So that would allow you to cut taxes by 35%.
Yeah.
And continue to properly fund public services.
But then the trouble, to conclude, Lord Agnew, is bring in a Chancellor that wants to challenge the status quo, or indeed a Prime Minister, and they last, what, a matter of days?
Yes, but she could have handled it a lot better. But you're right.
But has Jeremy Hunt similarly taken hostage?
I suspect so.
Lord Agnew, thank you very much indeed for your expertise this morning.
Thank you.
It's very interesting to speak to you.
The Live Desk with me, Mark Longhurst.
And me, Pip Thompson. It's here Monday to Friday on GB News.
From midday, we'll bring you the news as it breaks, whenever it's happening and wherever it's happening, from across the UK and around the world.
Refreshing, feisty, but with a bit of fun too.
If it matters to you, we'll have it covered on TV, radio and online.
Join the Live Desk on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
So Jubes and Kerr, we tackle the issues of the day with real, robust debate, both sides of the fence, battling it out with me in the middle with my forthright opinions and views. And often really interesting things happen because you start with a position and then by the end of the debate you find actually, well, I might not have thought about that one.
What we need in this country is 2 new political parties.
You should maybe think about doing a 2024 calendar. I'm Michelle Dewberry and I'm keeping you company right through until 7 o'clock this evening.
GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's watching.
Monday to Thursday, 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. Join me, Dan Wootton, for 2 hours packed full of unfiltered opinions, unique takes and fiery debates. I guarantee you blockbuster guests and exclusive reporting with no spin, no bias, no censorship.
I think there is a culture of collusion, quite frankly.
And no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight on TV, radio and online. Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. only on GB News, Britain's news channel.
In a world of dull and predictable radio and TV shows.
Oh, hi. On Mark Dolan tonight, we've got big guests. We drill into the big stories of the day. The show adds up to a brilliant listening and viewing experience. Mark Dolan Tonight is the most entertaining current affairs show ever, and that's a fact. That's Mark Dolan Tonight, Friday, Saturday and Sunday from 9. Only on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Like all families, we have arguments every now and then, but actually we agree on what the mission of GB News is, and that's the most fundamentally important thing.
GB News provides the kind of platform that lets all voices be heard. We don't hold back. We're free to say what we really think.
Just because some people who live in a tiny little Westminster bubble think that their particular story is important, that's not the most important story for me.
And often there will be difficult stories, stories that you won't find on the establishment media.
Because what people think in the north of England may be very different to what they're thinking in the home counties.
We're going to carry on telling the world what life is really like for households up and down the UK.
We love to be in your car, in your kitchen as you're having your breakfast. Whatever you're doing, you are part of the show. If it matters to you, it matters to us.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News,
the People's Channel,
Britain's news channel.
Welcome back to the Camilla Tominey Show. Well, it's the moment I've been waiting for. I'm sure you have too. We've got Alistair Stewart back in the studio, legendary news presenter at ITN and GB News, of course. Alistair, lovely to see you this morning. Great to be back, I'm sure.
It is absolutely terrific to be back, and I was sitting out there having a coffee with friends and chatting to Steve and people like that and watching the programme. Great programme.
Thank you.
So far, I hope I will be able to maintain the standard.
Oh, you are the standard. You are the benchmark here that we all aspire to. Look, you stood down from your role at GB News in March. You did release a statement at the time. You want to give that a bit more clarity. What would you like?
I did, and I wanted to give it a bit more clarity, A, here at GB News, but B, with you, because you have interviewed me before in the Telegraph days. And I think, you are one of the absolutely top best
Thank you.
interviewers, seriously. And any of the politicians who've sat down, including our mutual friend Charles Walker, will vouch for that. And the reason I wanted it to be here at GB News rather than anywhere else was because GB News have looked after me phenomenally well. I mean, the headline story, and it is relatively dramatic, I suppose, is that about 6-9 months ago, I began to feel one of my favourite words, a bit discombobulated.
Yeah.
I wasn't becoming forgetful, but things like doing up your shoelaces properly, that's how I wear these lovely moccasins now, making sure your tie was straight, remembering that the call time for your programme is 4 o'clock and not 5 o'clock, not turning up early or late and stuff like that. And I then decided at my ripe old age of late 50s, early 60s, that I might have something wrong up here.
Yeah.
So I went to see my GP, who's brilliant, and I said, look, I'm really worried that I might have dementia, early onset dementia.
Yeah.
And the GP, to his credit, said, I don't know, I've no idea. Sometimes people of your age, particularly if they've had a really fascinating, active life, try to find excuses because they can't quite cope with old age. But the only way you can find out is have a scan. And I had a scan, and then it was like a scene from Casualty or Emergency Ward 10, because the results came back, and I had indeed had a series of minor strokes that are called infarct strokes.
Yes.
Not the big one where your face falls down and your arm goes doolally, but it's like pepper shots. And that the cumulative effect of that was that I had a diagnosis of early onset vascular dementia. And so GB News didn't then say, oh, God, well, that's hopeless. We can't, can't have you on screen or anything like that. Quite the opposite. GB News, across the spectrum, and my team, and I just bumped into a couple of them outside, which was lovely, were amongst those who were saying, are you sure you're OK? We're a bit worried about you. Just drew together as one and backed me. So I remain on the books.
Yes.
I have what's called a contributor contract, so I can come and do stuff like this. Had a lovely interview with Cameron Walker about the death of the late Queen and the accession of King Charles, and I'm hoping other things will crop up over time. But they were just so totally loyal to me.
When the GP kind of broke that bombshell news, Alistair, what was your reaction? Were you surprised? Were you horrified?
All of the above, but also relieved, because I knew that there was something amiss, but I didn't know what it was. And to be crystal clear, it's not like sitting opposite a man or a woman in a blue or a white coat with a stethoscope round their neck saying, I'm sorry, I've got some bad news for you. You've got cancer and you've probably only got 6 months to live. No. Quite the opposite. With dementia, Alzheimer's is a totally different argument, but with vascular dementia, you can't cure it, but you can ameliorate it. We were chatting about what a lovely word that was earlier on before we started the conversation. So, for example, I've given up smoking.
Yeah.
And the NHS have been brilliant on that as well. The NHS have actually been brilliant throughout.
Good.
And there's a little bit of central government money that went to the NHS saying, look, let's try and help people stop smoking who want to, genuinely. Because I'm obviously costing the NHS money. If I got cancer, God forbid, I'd cost them even more. So I've stopped smoking. That helps. I take the dogs for a purposeful, slightly longer walk than I used to. And my diet's OK. I don't drink heavily and haven't done for quite some time. But there are bits and pieces that you can do to stop it getting worse.
Word searches, trying to keep the brain active.
Yeah.
People watching this interview and listening to it on the radio will think you sound like the Alistair Stewart of old, 45 years in the business, longest-serving broadcaster in this country. You're totally lucid. People's impression of dementia is you get a diagnosis like that and it's game over, but you haven't had that experience.
No, quite the opposite. And it's so kind of you to say that, and I do hope that's how people feel, because my two consultants, I have a cardio consultant to try and figure out why the blood pressure is so high, because that's what causes these little strokes in most cases. And then I have a stroke consultant who's working with me on how to ameliorate the condition. Both of them said to my wife, who comes to all of my appointments, it's really weird, because we know exactly who you are and we've kind of grown up with you.
Yeah.
And it would be impossible to diagnose you with dementia from sitting down and having a conversation with you. Quite the opposite. You'd think this bloke, nothing wrong with this bloke, he's just, you know, he's spinning a yarn. It will progressively get worse, but it won't ever get to that point of you becoming completely doolally. And that was the other reason I wanted, apart from to say thank you to GB News, quite genuinely, was to publicly say that the NHS is out there. It's having a tough time. I don't support the strikes. I'm very upset by the strikes. But those who've still been working, who've been looking after me, GP, nurses, occupational therapy, the consultants, have all been utterly brilliant. One of the consultants phoned up the other day of an evening just to say, are you OK, everything all right? And don't forget you're coming to see us on Tuesday or whatever. And my wife said, aren't you supposed to be on strike? Which, fortunately, that was the reaction at the other end of the phone as well as in the house.
There's a sense of humour throughout all this, which is great for your wife, Sally, and I know you've got 4 children. But the impact on the family, Alistair, I mean, it must have been quite substantial.
It is huge, and the family have been utterly brilliant. My daughter, who's been on GB News, and my team, who I mentioned earlier, who said, are you sure you're OK, know her as well. She's working in Saudi Arabia at the moment, but we do FaceTime very regularly and we chat very regularly. My eldest son, Alex, who I've often talked about on the programme when I used to do it as well, who is utterly brilliant on sport and particularly football analysis. He's sitting outside. They've been brilliant. I think, to me, you said about the shock and the impact upon you, the thing I have found most difficult to deal with, genuinely, is the impact it's had on Sally, my wife. We've been married for nearly half a century. And, you know, your life partner, your lover, all of those descriptions that are personal and intimate, that person is reduced, I choose my words very carefully, almost to a carer.
Yes.
So, like this morning, we'd had long conversations about what I wanted to say to you, and you were kind enough, and we had a lovely conversation on the phone the other day as well, and Alex and Clem. But her role this morning was to make sure that I was ready for when the car came and that the tie was up, done properly, that the suit, shirt, tie matched and what have you. And for a woman who spent nearly as long as I did in this industry as a top technician, brilliant production assistant, I find that tricky because your health, through no fault of your own, is reducing this person who is the most important single person in your life to the role of a carer. And so if you do think that there's something wrong with you, go and see the GP, listen to what he or she says, but also do remember that the people you work with and the people you live with and share your life with are the most important people in the entire world. And they are there, if you're lucky enough, as I was, to help you.
Monday to Thursday nights on GB News. At 6, it's Dubes & Co. 7 o'clock, Farage. At 8, join Jacob Rees-Mogg. And at 9, Dan Wootton Tonight, followed by Headliners. On TV, radio and online. This is GB News.
Now then, Lee Anderson here. Join me on GB News on my show, The Real World, every Friday at 7 p.m.
I'm not eating bloody cat. Are you
delicious.
mental?
Open your mouth. OK, here comes a train. Reminds me of the scene in Singing in the Rain.
Adam, is that a good one?
Whoa! Join me at 7 on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Camilla Tominey, on Sunday mornings from 9:30, taking the politicians to task and breaking out of SW1 to see how their decisions are affecting you across the UK. Bursting the Westminster bubble every Sunday morning, only on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain's watching.
Join us every night on GB News at 11 p.m. for Headliners, which is 3 top comedians going through the next day's news stories, which is exactly what you need, because when the establishment has gone crazy, you need some craziness to make sense of it. So join us 11 p.m. every night on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel. every Sunday from 11. Join Michael Portillo.
There'll be topical discussion, looking at the week before and the week to come. So kick back and relax at 11 a.m. on Sundays on GB News with me, Michael Portillo. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I joined GB News because I was sick and tired of not hearing my views being represented, not just mine, but so many people that I knew and spoke to.
I just couldn't get my voice out there. I couldn't say anything. I couldn't do anything. Whatever the narrative was, I kind of had to follow it.
GB News is there to provide a voice for those who have been ignored by the establishment media. We think different things. We've got a different style.
GB News is here to be optimistic and positive about the future.
It's real kind of dynamic and flowing, with the audience very much at the heart of it, like a big family.
Here at GB News, we talk about the things that matter to you.
Hearing the voices from right across our towns and cities, especially our towns.
All sides of the argument represented with a heavy dose of opinion.
We're on a mission here to make a difference.
And the GB News family really is here for you, and whatever time of day you can watch or listen.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
How are the symptoms manifesting themselves? Because we talked about you being perfectly lucid, you know, you're thinking straight, but I'm getting the impression that it's really affected some of your motor skills, and perhaps tell us about whether it's affected your memory as well.
Yeah, motor skills is which was a description I wasn't totally familiar with, but that was one of the things that Clem said. But yes, you know, like shoelaces and ties and stuff like that. And being a teacher, obviously, she notices the development of motor skills with children, and some are not as quick as others, and the rest of it. The memory, long-term and medium-term memory, is not a problem at all, period. So I'm as excited as you are about the relative imminence of a general election, and
Well, you've covered so many.
I've been doing general elections since the 60s.
Since the dawn of time.
Yeah, since the dawn of time, since the invention of democracy. And fortunately, my memory of constituencies and who won and who didn't win and score draws like the coalition it is fairly good. My very short-term memory sometimes it is a bit slow, and I tend to write a lot more down in a little notebook or on the blackboard in the kitchen.
Just writing yourself notes?
Just so that I'll remember what am I doing tomorrow. But when it's things that really matter, like medical appointments, Sal, bless her heart, does all of that. So if the GP phones up, or one of the consultants, or a letter comes saying, you know, you're due to come and see us for X, Y, or Z, then I just hand over the letter or the phone to Sal, because obviously that's something that's important and that I don't want to get wrong, and I can't afford to get wrong. So very, very short-term memory is tricky. Motor skills, definitely tricky. One of the things, fortunately, which, if you read all the literature on it, it talks about spatial awareness. So things like that, I remember thinking spatial awareness. I was worried that when the floor manager, brilliant, another Camilla, brought me in, you know, make sure you don't trip over. Well, if Lavrov can trip up on his way to go and meet Modi, and Biden can trip up on the way down, I'm in good company if that happens. But I haven't had that spatial awareness problem at all. One weird thing is old-fashioned clocks. So if I glance down at a digital clock, that's not a problem. But if I glance down at this one, old-fashioned analog one, or the big one in the kitchen at home, it sometimes takes me a while. Or if I'm not allowed to set it anymore because I always get it wrong. And the digital clocks are brilliant, and that's much better. So that's a perception thing, that whatever little bit of my brain looks at it and says, right, if the big hand's there and the little one's there, it's 8 o'clock or whatever. That's obviously had a stroke at some stage.
Yes.
So I'm not as sharp on that.
Infarct, strokes, obviously you had no idea at the time it was happening.
None at all. Long conversations with the stroke consultant, and he occasionally will say, you know, have you had any neurological episodes or anything like that? And I said, what do you mean? He said, like, sudden shocks, headaches, or things like that, or things that have happened in your life that have been very disruptive or very upsetting or anything like that. And fortunately, the answer to both of those questions is no. Looking back at what happened when I left ITN and when I moved on to a pension, and I had a punch up with an accountant over various bits and pieces to do with my pension, that I've talked about that with the consultants, and high pressure episodes like that.
Stressful.
Very stressful.
ITN.
Yeah, because again, I knew a little bit about it, but I've read, as you can imagine, because you know me, and I do. I read as much as I can anyway. But the connection with blood pressure is absolutely the headline.
Yeah.
And that's why if you think you've got what I've got, or that you might develop it, then right now, Alistair Stewart to camera, stop smoking. If you have an occasional glass of wine, fair enough. If you regularly get completely out of it, stop.
Yes.
And if you do go for a walk occasionally, do it more frequently. Because if you can get your blood pressure under control, and it is most likely to be lifestyle things rather than something pathological.
You may never know what caused them, but at the end of the day, you have spent 45 years in front of the camera, and that is at times a really stressful job. I mean, we looked through, obviously I've sort of revised once again your illustrious CV. And we look at some of the things you've covered, obviously the miners' strike back in the day, the fall of the Berlin Wall. You went to the first Gulf War and you reported there from Kuwait, reporting from Kuwait City. You fronted up every ITV's news programme that there was. Obviously, you then had a change of career quite late on in your life, as you say, late 60s to come GB News. That's a lot of stress for one man to cope with. Performative careers are, by very definition, pretty stressful.
Yes, I think that sometimes folk at home who are kind enough to watch us or listen to us on digital radio or online or however they do it, if we do it, hopefully, touch wood, as well as you do and I used to and others like Steve this morning, think that's, it's not quite a walk in the park, but we do a lot of homework. You've got a lot of it in front of you now, so that when you go into the studio, you are prepared to do it.
Yeah.
But you've got an earpiece in. The director is saying, OK, fine, we've got about 4 minutes to go on this now. And don't forget that you're talking to X next, or when you were talking to Alex Chalk earlier on about the escape, and you were then going to be talking to the minister about fraud and stuff like that. That's constantly coming in. But you mentioned one or two of the things there. So like Berlin. Berlin's a classic example. I was ill. I wasn't ill then. I was absolutely fit as a fiddle, totally on top of my game. But you've got to remember the history of the Berlin Wall. Yeah. You've got to remember the history of the Soviet Union, the Cold War. You've also got to remember what your dad, in my case, said to me as a serving Bomber Command senior officer about what the Berlin Wall meant and what the Cold War was really about. And I can remember, I absolutely remember every word of all of that and what I'd read. And if you and I then pause and we then go on to do something else, and suddenly from India, we get word that Sunak has decided that the trade talks have gone so well, he's going to call a snappy election, which of course he can do now. Then
we've got to move on that.
Yeah, and we'd be ready, and we'd both be ready to do that.
I know. Well, in light of the fact that you've always been ready to do that, and in fact, you said in your biography for GB News when you first started, you wrote a little piece, and you said the biggest compliment that was ever made to you is that people used to hope Al was in if a big story broke because you're such a safe pair of hands. Now, we wanted to make an announcement on the show today because, as I think you know, we are launching a new set of Westminster studios in Westminster. Because we're here in Paddington and that's great, but when I'm interviewing MPs and Chris Hope is interviewing them and all the rest of it, we need a studio close to the House of Parliament. Yeah. Now, we are going to be naming our main Westminster studio the Alistair Stewart Westminster Studio in your honour, and we wanted to tell you that this morning.
Did you also want to reduce me to tears? Because you have just done so. Cameron showed me around the studio complex when I did the interview with him about the Queen and the King, and it's utterly fantastic. And you mentioned there just in passing Chopper being a part of the team now.
You're pleased with this, Alistair. I've got someone, as you know now, winding me up in my ear.
I'm deeply honoured. I'm deeply honoured and deeply touched by that, and I look forward to working from there as we get closer to the election.
Alistair, I hope we see you again in this studio because we'd love to see you back on GB News, and we wish you all the very best with your health following this diagnosis. Thank you so much for
Camilla, thank you very much indeed. And again, to tighten the line straight to the camera, thank you, GB News and the whole team here for looking after me and being really good employers And don't forget, thank you, NHS, as well.
We'll leave
I'll be
it
fine.
there.
I'll see you soon.
The temperature's rising. Boxed Solar, proud sponsors of weather on GB News.
Good evening, my name's Rachel Ayres and welcome to your latest GB News weather forecast brought to you by the Met Office. So there's been plenty of heavy showers and thunderstorms around throughout today and they will continue during tonight. And this is because low pressure is starting to dominate the UK weather, clearing away that high pressure we saw during last week. So into this evening then, showers and thunderstorms will continue for a while, but generally starting to clear out into the North Sea, though lingering for a little longer across southern Scotland. Clear spells in the east, but some mist, fog and low cloud developing, and that's all during another warm and fairly humid night. There will be some brightness to start Monday, but any mist, fog and low cloud will lift and break before we see this area of cloud and outbreaks of rain spreading southeastwards. Maybe some heavy showers and thunderstorms for England and Wales just ahead of that. But there will be some sunny spells too, and feeling pleasant in the sunshine still, even though we're not getting into the 30s, still the mid to high 20s for the highs on Monday. As we go into Tuesday, that band of cloud and rain continues to make its way southeastwards, becoming a little heavier and slow moving as it comes across England and Wales. But starting to see those winds come from the north across parts of Scotland, Northern England and Northern Ireland. So starting to feel cooler, but generally remaining changeable throughout the week. But most noticeably, those temperatures dropping down to average.
The temperature's rising. Boxed Solar, proud sponsors of weather on GB News.
What you get for breakfast is something that, if we do our jobs right, you will wake up to news that you didn't know the night before.
It's a conversation. It's not just me and Eamon.
We want to get to know you, and we want you to get to know us.
From 6, it's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Monday to Thursdays on GB News.
Britain's news channel.
Westminster is going around in ever-decreasing circles, followed by the media. Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it? Join me at 7 p.m, Mondays to Thursdays on Farage, here